Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into what is honestly one of the most fascinating chronological mysteries in biblical history. We're talking about the exact line of the book of Revelation, specifically chapter 12. Now, if you've spent any time studying eschatology or biblical history, you know that trying to pin these prophetic events onto a strict timeline, well, it can kind of feel like walking through a minefield. But today, we're going to unpack how our source material uses the text itself, along with some pretty wild historical records, to argue exactly where these events actually belong.
So let's start with this brilliant metaphor from our source. They call it the interpretive Rubik's Cube. The idea here is that some approaches to the text treat it just like a giant puzzle, endlessly twisting and rearranging the scriptures to make them fit into these prepackaged narratives, like taking chapter 12 entirely out of sequence and just dropping it decades earlier. The big question we really need to ask ourselves today is this: are we actually solving a chronological puzzle, or are we just breaking the timeline altogether? To figure that out, we've got a solid docket of evidence to run through. We'll kick things off with the interpretive Rubik's Cube. Then we'll look at why the nativity reading fails, the 1260-day time lock, history's hostile witnesses, the apostolic timeline trap, and finally, why we need to stop twisting the text.
All right, section 1, the interpretive Rubik's Cube. And listen, this isn't just about splitting academic hairs here. This gets right down to the absolute core of how we read and understand historical texts. It really all boils down to two concepts: eisegesis versus exegesis. Eisegesis is when you impose your own meaning onto the text, right? While exegesis is when you draw the meaning directly out of it. When interpretive strategies are constantly clashing with what the Bible explicitly says, like ignoring clear time markers and sequences, well, the source poses a super critical question. Are we letting the historical text dictate the timeline, or are we just rewriting it from scratch to match a theological system we already prefer?
Moving on to section 2, why the nativity reading fails. This brings us right to the absolute most common attempt to try and rearrange this timeline. Let's look at why the source argues this specific reading of Revelation 12 completely collapses under scrutiny.
You see, there's this massive temptation to drag chapter 12 all the way back to the birth of Jesus, somewhere around 6 BC. And you can kind of see why, right? A woman gives birth to a male child, a dragon tries to devour it. I mean, it sounds an awful lot like Mary, baby Jesus, and King Herod. But let's actually contrast these two events. After the birth in Revelation 12, the woman flees into the wilderness where she's nourished for exactly 1,260 days. But history tells us Mary fled temporarily to Egypt, not the wilderness, to escape Herod. And she definitely didn't stay there for exactly 1,260 days. The source argues that taking Mary's brief, temporary trip to Egypt and conflating it with this massive 3.5-year wilderness escape, it literally just breaks the entire narrative sequence.
Okay, section 3, the 1260-day time lock. So, if this isn't about the nativity, then when exactly is it? Let's do a little math and see how our source builds this definitive, absolute, chronological wall.
The really crucial point here lies in the numbers that are scattered all across Revelation chapters 11, 12, and 13. We see 42 months, 1,260 days, and this specific phrase, a time, times, and half a time. What do all of these have in common? Well, they all equal exactly 3.5 years. The argument here is that these are not just random numbers pulled out of thin air. No, they act as a time lock, inextricably binding chapters 11, 12, and 13 together. Chapter 11 describes Jerusalem being trampled for 1,260 days, and as the source points out, that didn't happen in 26 CE during the ministry of Jesus. It happened during the incredibly destructive siege of Jerusalem from 67 to 70 CE that anchors chapter 12 right to this exact historical period. And what's wild is that we actually find this fascinating parallel confirmation of this exact same event over in the Gospel of Matthew. In chapter 24, Jesus issues this super urgent warning. He says, "Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." He's talking directly about the impending desolation of Jerusalem. The source notes how this perfectly mirrors John's vision in Revelation 12, where the woman, who represents the faithful community of believers, flees into the wilderness to escape the zealot sedition and the Roman siege. It's the exact same event, just viewed from two completely different angles. All right, section 4, history's hostile witnesses. Now, right about now, you might be thinking, okay, sure, but this is all internal biblical evidence, and fair enough. So next, the source calls some very unexpected, completely neutral, and honestly even hostile historical witnesses to the stand. Revelation 12 describes this massive, epic war in heaven. Now, if we try to force this chapter back to the early ministry of Jesus between 26 and 33 CE,
The source highlights a pretty glaring problem, a major historical void. There is absolutely zero historical record of aerial battles during that time. Literally, nobody noticed armies fighting in the sky. But if you jump forward to the 60s CE, suddenly the historical record just lights up. The Jewish historian Josephus explicitly dates an event to May of 62 CE, where chariots and armed soldiers were actually seen running among the clouds. And then, right during the siege of Jerusalem, between 67 and 70 CE, the Roman historian Tacitus records an incredibly similar phenomenon.
You have to listen to this stunning quote from Tacitus's histories. He writes, "Armies were seen to fight in the sky. The doors of the temple were opened on a sudden, and a voice greater than human was heard, that the gods were retiring." Now keep in mind, Tacitus was a Roman pagan. The guy had absolutely no theological agenda to try and fulfill Christian prophecy. Yet here he is, documenting a highly visible, epic battle in the skies directly over Jerusalem right during the siege. Our source argues that this gives massive, undeniable historical weight to the heavenly war that John described in Revelation 12.
And this just brilliantly illustrates how the exact same historical event can be viewed through two totally different lenses. Both Tacitus's sources and John witnessed this exact same superhuman voice during the siege. Tacitus, operating from his pagan worldview, interpreted it as, oh, the gods are departing in defeat. But John, who was receiving prophetic revelation, recorded the loud voice saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God have come. It's the same event, the same voice, the exact same time frame. So the argument here is that if you pull Revelation 12 out of this 67 to 70 CE window, you are completely ignoring this incredible piece of historical corroboration.
That brings us to Section 5, the apostolic timeline trap. Let's explore a little logical trap that the source says ends up catching a lot of interpreters who try to force this timeline backward. And it all revolves around the Apostle Paul. Let me pose a really simple question to you. Can you prophesy about the past? I mean, by definition, a prophecy is about the future, right? If you're predicting something that already happened decades ago, well, you aren't a prophet, you're just a historian. Keep that thought in the back of your mind as we look at this next piece of evidence. Back in 1 Thessalonians, which was written around 50 CE, the Apostle Paul prophesies a future event where the Lord is going to descend with the voice of an archangel. And we know from Revelation 12 that this archangel is Michael, the one leading the heavenly battle. The source points out a major trap here. Because if you relocate Revelation 12 to the year 26 CE, you're saying that Michael's great heavenly battle had already happened. Which means when Paul was writing to the Thessalonians in 50 CE, telling them to eagerly await this future event, he would have actually been talking about something that happened 24 years in the past. According to the source, doing this just makes the entire timeline chronologically impossible and, honestly, completely incoherent.
Which brings us to our final point. Section 6. Stop twisting the text. If it breaks the timeline, why do it? Well, we finally reached the climax of our explainer. We're going to uncover the true motive the source identifies behind all this interpretive chaos.
The source identifies what they call a strategic conflation. Basically, some interpretations try to merge Revelation 12 and Revelation 20 together as if they are the exact same event. But look at what the text actually says. In chapter 12, Satan is cast down to earth, where he furiously pursues the woman and makes war. He is active, angry, and highly dangerous. But in chapter 20, Satan is cast into a bottomless pit. He's sealed inside and completely prevented from deceiving the nations. He's totally powerless. By treating an active, furious Satan as identical to a bound, powerless Satan, the author argues that this interpretation secretly compresses the timeline and basically erases the 1,000-year millennium entirely. And according to the source, the cost of doing this kind of conflation? It's massive. Merging these timelines together doesn't just butcher the biblical narrative, it directly conflicts with massive, documented historical tragedies. Think about it. Forcing all these prophecies to end neatly by 70 CE means you have to completely ignore the massive Bar Kokhba results of 132 to 136 CE. This is an event firmly corroborated by Roman chronicles, like Dio Cassius, who recorded an unbelievable 580,000 casualties. It means completely ignoring the Talmudic rabbis. The argument is essentially that actual history is being denied just to protect a preferred theological framework. And that brings us to this incredibly powerful warning from the Apostle Paul over in 2 Timothy. He talks about those who are always learning and never able to arrive at a knowledge of the truth. Man, that perfectly describes the exact challenge of the interpretive Rubik's Cube we've been talking about today. You can spend a whole lifetime constantly rearranging texts, inventing all these clever new solutions that honestly just end up creating more questions without ever actually listening to the sequential history the text might be trying to tell you. So I'll leave you with this final provocative thought from our source. Are we willing to let historical and biblical texts speak for themselves, even if it totally challenges our preferred frameworks? Or will we just remain stuck forever, spinning the interpretive Rubik's Cube? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep digging, and keep asking the hard questions.